They say water is worth more than gold in the desert, but that day it was worth more than a life. The sun hung over the dunes like a blowtorch, white and merciless, flattening the world into heat and glare as Ethan Cole staggered across the rippling expanse of sand with his boots sinking an inch at a time into the blistering surface. His suit's cracked display flickered at the edge of his vision, reading 121 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing, hydration level at 3%, warning icons pulsing in tired red. The rover lay half a mile behind him, its chassis swallowed by a glassed-over patch of fused sand from the plasma storm that had rolled through 12 hours earlier, frying circuits and turning his survey mission into a slow walk toward nowhere. The wind carried fine grains that hissed against his visor like static, whispering over the dunes in long, lonely sighs, and every breath felt like pulling air through a furnace filter. He lifted the canteen clip to his belt and gave it a small shake. The slosh inside was faint, maybe a few swallows at best, the last of what he had rationed since the emergency beacon failed. His tongue felt thick, his lips split at the corners, and the back of his throat burned with the steady ache of thirst he could no longer ignore. He told himself he'd drink once he reached the next ridge, once he confirmed there was nothing but more sand, once he accepted that rescue wasn't coming anytime soon. The desert had a way of shrinking a man down to the basics: shade, breath, water. He crested the ridge slowly, boots sliding on the incline, heart pounding harder than the effort required, and that was when he saw her. At first she looked like a mirage, a shimmer of color against the endless tan, something blue and silver half buried near the base of a wind-carved outcrop. Ethan blinked, wiped his visor with the back of his glove, and looked again. She was real. A tall figure sprawled on her side, skin the color of deep ocean water with a faint metallic sheen catching the sunlight, garments of intricate fabric torn and dusted with sand, long pale hair fanned around her like spilled silk. Even from 20 yards away he could tell she wasn't human. Her frame was slender but strong, elongated. In a way that spoke of a different gravity, a different world. A thin band of delicate metal circled her brow, etched with symbols that glinted in the harsh light. He felt a jolt of caution tighten his chest. This sector had been flagged as restricted, rumored to belong to an off-world power with little patience for trespassers. He adjusted his path instinctively, angling away from her toward the low shadow of the rocks, telling himself he didn't have enough to spare, not water, not strength, not risk. But as he took a step, the wind shifted and carried a sound to him, soft and fragile, barely more than a breath, an exhale that trembled in the heat. He froze. The canteen felt heavier at his hip. He could almost taste the water inside, cool and life-giving, meant for him alone. He glanced back at her motionless form, the sun baking down on blue skin that had already begun to dull under the relentless glare. He wasn't a hero. He was a survey tech with a busted rover and a failing suit. Saving anyone wasn't in his job description. Yet his boots turned before his mind finished arguing, carrying him across the hot sand toward the stranger who lay exposed beneath two unforgiving suns, and with every step the faint slosh of water at his side sounded louder than the wind. The sand gave way beneath Ethan's knees as he reached her, heat bleeding through the reinforced fabric of his suit while the wind traced thin lines across her blue skin. Up close he could see the faint rise and fall of her chest, shallow and uneven, and the delicate metal circlet on her brow pulsed with a dim internal glow, almost out of power. He hesitated only a second before kneeling fully, setting his pack down in the narrow shadow cast by the rock outcrop, and touching two fingers to the side of her neck where a subtle pattern shimmered beneath the surface. The warmth there was real, but fading. Her eyelids fluttered at the contact, revealing eyes of molten gold that focused slowly, warily, locking onto the unfamiliar shape of his visor. Instinct sharpened her expression, and though her movements were weak she attempted to push herself upright, breath catching in a soft rasp as the effort cost her. Ethan raised both hands, palms open, a universal gesture he hoped translated across species. "I am not here to hurt you," he said, his voice sounding thin inside his helmet as the suit translated it into a neutral frequency. She stared at him as if weighing his worth in silence, then tried to speak. The words came out fractured and dry, carried away by the wind before the translator could fully assemble them. He did not need the device to understand the meaning behind her gaze. Thirst. He unclipped the canteen from his belt and felt the last of his certainty drain with it. The metal was hot from the sun, almost too warm to hold. He unscrewed the cap slowly, aware of how small the sound seemed in the vast desert, and the faint scent of treated water reached him like a memory of cooler days. His throat tightened reflexively. He could drink now and still walk another mile, maybe two. He could leave her with a fraction and tell himself he had tried. Instead he tipped the canteen toward her lips, steadying her head with one gloved hand. For a heartbeat she did not move, suspicion flickering across her features, pride holding her still. Then the wind gusted harder, lifting strands of pale hair across her face, and she allowed him to bring the opening closer. The first swallow was careful, controlled, but when the water touched her tongue her composure fractured. She drank in measured pulls, disciplined even in desperation, and Ethan forced himself to look away so he would not count how much remained. The canteen grew lighter in his hand. When she finally leaned back, a thin line of moisture traced along her chin before evaporating in the heat. She closed her eyes briefly, as if committing the sensation to memory. "Why?" she asked after a moment, the translator catching up with her steady but accented tone. "Would you give survival resources to a stranger?" Ethan replaced the cap and clipped the canteen back to his belt, knowing by the hollow sound that almost nothing remained. "Because you were here," he replied simply. Her gaze sharpened, studying him with a focus that felt far older than the desert itself, and for the first time the gold in her eyes softened, not with gratitude but with recognition, as if she had discovered something rare in a place where nothing survived without taking first. The wind continued its endless sweep across the dunes, but in the narrow shadow of the rocks the air felt different, charged not with heat but with a quiet understanding neither of them spoke aloud. The wind shifted again, carrying a deeper hum beneath its steady hiss, something distant but mechanical that Ethan felt more than heard, a vibration threading through the soles of his boots and into his bones. The woman beside him stiffened before he could ask, her gaze lifting toward the horizon where the sky shimmered in bands of heat. "Sensors," she murmured, pressing slender fingers against the circlet on her brow as its glow strengthened from a fading pulse to a steady line of silver light. Ethan followed her eyes and saw it then, a distortion far above the dunes, like air bending around an invisible structure. Whatever it was, it did not belong to the desert. He swallowed against the dryness in his throat and forced himself upright, the world tilting slightly as dehydration made his vision narrow at the edges. "If that is yours," he said, nodding toward the sky, "then you are about to have company." She pushed herself to her feet with more control than he expected, though the movement cost her, and she steadied herself against the rock, drawing in a careful breath. "They search for me," she replied, voice regaining strength with each word, "but they will not see clearly through the storm residue. Not unless I signal." Ethan glanced at the canteen out of habit, forgetting for a moment how light it had become, and then back at her. He had imagined rescue as something that would belong to him, a beacon answering his call, a human vessel breaking the horizon with familiar markings. Instead the sky answered her. The distortion above condensed into form, sleek and luminous, descending without sound as if the air parted willingly around it. Its hull reflected the twin suns in ribbons of pale blue and white, and as it lowered toward the dunes a circular pattern of light expanded beneath it, brushing the sand without disturbing a single grain. Ethan felt suddenly small in the open desert, a lone surveyor in dust-streaked gear standing beside a figure who now seemed less stranded traveler and more center of gravity. She turned toward him, studying his face without the filter of suspicion this time, her golden eyes clear and unwavering. "What is your name?" she asked, not as a challenge but as a request. "Ethan Cole," he answered, his voice rough but steady. "Just Ethan." She repeated it slowly, as if testing the shape of the sound, committing it to something deeper than memory. "Ethan." The craft settled a few yards away and a line of figures emerged, tall and composed, their attire marked with the same silver patterns as the band on her brow. They paused when they saw him, attention sharpening, but none stepped forward without her signal. She lifted one hand slightly and they lowered their heads in silent acknowledgement. Ethan understood then what he had not allowed himself to assume. "You are not just a traveler," he said quietly. "No," she replied, a faint curve of solemn honesty touching her expression. "I am Liara Vale of the House of Ailen. Their princess." The title did not carry arrogance, it carried weight. The wind continued its endless sweep across the dunes, but the desert no longer felt empty. One of the figures approached with a device that projected a cool field of air around her, and the difference in temperature brushed Ethan's overheated skin like a memory of rain. She stepped closer to him before entering the light, close enough that he could see faint crystalline patterns along her irises. "You gave me life when the desert would not," she said softly. "That will not be forgotten." Ethan watched as she moved toward her waiting people, her silhouette framed against the gleaming hull, and for the first time since the storm he allowed himself to sit back against the rock, exhaustion washing over him. Above, the ship brightened and began to rise, but through the thinning glare he could still feel her gaze on him, as if the shape of his face had already been carved into something that would endure long after the sand had shifted again. The light from the ascending craft faded into the blinding noon sky, leaving only heat and silence behind, and for a long moment Ethan remained seated against the rock as if the desert had pressed him into place. The wind resumed its steady sweep across the dunes, indifferent to titles and departures, and the temperature display inside his visor blinked insistently at 124 degrees Fahrenheit as his hydration warning shifted from caution to critical. He tried to stand and the world tilted sharply, a gray haze closing in at the edges of his vision. The last of his strength felt like sand slipping through open fingers. Somewhere above him a new shadow formed, not as distant this time but close and deliberate, and cool air washed over his faceplate as a containment field settled around him with the soft hum of controlled energy. He heard measured footsteps on sand that did not crunch, voices speaking in tones too refined for the harsh landscape, and then the visor of his helmet retracted with a quiet click as a device interfaced gently with his suit. "Do not sleep yet," a calm voice instructed in clear English filtered through a translator far more advanced than his own. Ethan forced his eyes open and found himself looking up at one of the tall figures he had seen before, blue skin marked with silver lines that caught the light like circuitry. The figure held a slender instrument that emitted a faint mist, cool and clean, and when it brushed against Ethan's lips he tasted water again, this time crisp and pure. He swallowed reflexively, the relief immediate and almost painful in its intensity, and a steady stream followed, measured and controlled, restoring what he had willingly given away. Through the haze he saw her again, standing just beyond the edge of the field, no longer swaying, no longer diminished by thirst. Princess Liara Vale watched without speaking, her posture composed, her golden eyes reflecting something deeper than gratitude. "You are under the protection of the House of Ailen," she said after a moment, her voice carrying across the hum of the field with quiet authority. "The desert will not claim you." Ethan managed a faint smile, more instinct than confidence. "I was managing," he replied, though even he heard the weakness in it. A faint glimmer of amusement touched her expression, brief but unmistakable. "You were surviving," she corrected gently. "There is a difference." The containment field brightened and the sensation of weightlessness replaced the crushing pull of gravity. Sand fell away beneath him as he was lifted toward the open hatch of the vessel, the interior lit in soft blue tones that felt like shade after endless glare. As he crossed the threshold, he looked back once at the stretch of dunes that had nearly ended his journey. The rover's distant silhouette barely visible against the horizon, and then his gaze found hers again. She did not bow, did not offer grand declarations. Instead she stepped closer and placed her hand briefly over her heart, a gesture precise and deliberate. "Your name is recorded, Ethan Cole," she said. "Not as a subject. Not as a trespasser. As the one who chose to give." The hatch sealed with a muted whisper and the desert disappeared from view, replaced by the steady glow of controlled atmosphere and the quiet assurance of advanced systems. For the first time since the storm, Ethan allowed himself to close his eyes, not in surrender but in trust, carried upward by a people who would remember a simple act in a place where nothing survived without taking first. The interior of the vessel felt impossibly still after the relentless wind, a controlled climate holding at 72 degrees Fahrenheit with air that carried a faint mineral sweetness instead of dust. Ethan lay on a narrow platform that adjusted beneath him with quiet precision, scanning lights tracing along his arms and chest while translucent panels displayed readings and symbols that shifted into English for his benefit. Hydration stabilizing, a measured voice announced, and a gentle warmth spread through his veins as the administered fluids restored what the desert had stripped away. He flexed his fingers slowly, watching the tremor fade, and turned his head to take in the curved architecture of the chamber, walls seamless and luminous, no visible seams or bolts, everything flowing as if shaped rather than built. The door opened without sound and Princess Liara Vale entered alone this time, her presence altering the room without raising her voice. She wore a simple garment of deep blue fabric that moved like liquid light, the circlet on her brow now glowing with steady strength. "You recover quickly," she observed, studying the monitors before meeting his eyes. "Good equipment," he replied, pushing himself upright with care. "And good timing." She stepped closer, not with ceremony but with intent, and placed a small crystalline object on the console beside him. It refracted the overhead light into faint prisms that danced across the surface. "This device recorded biometric resonance at the moment of contact," she explained. "When you offered water, it captured more than data. It captured intent." Ethan gave a short, quiet laugh that surprised even him. "I did not know I was being recorded." "You were not," she answered. "It activates only when my life signs approach critical failure." Her gaze softened briefly. "It is rare for the record to show selfless exchange from an unbound source." "Unbound source," he repeated, tasting the formal phrasing. "That is what I am." A faint tilt of her head acknowledged the distinction. "You are not sworn to my house, not obligated by treaty, not compelled by expectation. Yet you gave." The vessel shifted subtly, a low hum indicating ascent beyond the lower atmosphere, and the monitors adjusted to compensate. Outside the curved viewport the desert shrank into abstract bands of color before dissolving into cloud and then into the black curve of space. Ethan followed the sight with quiet awe. "I was just doing what felt right," he said finally. Liara regarded him as if that answer carried more weight than any formal pledge. "Among my people, survival is calculated," she said. "Resources are allocated with precision. Choice is measured. You disrupted that equation." He leaned back against the platform, feeling strength returning with each steady breath. "I did not think of equations," he admitted. She moved to the viewport, hands clasped loosely behind her back, posture reflective rather than regal. "That is why it mattered," she said softly. Beyond the glass, the twin suns cast pale halos along the planet's curve, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence was not empty, it held recognition, a shared awareness that something small had shifted in ways no instrument could fully chart. At last she turned toward him again. "When we reach the capital, there will be questions," she said. "Protocol demands explanation. I will answer them." Ethan studied her expression, searching for the distance that had marked their first meeting, and found instead a quiet steadiness. "I did not give water for reward," he said. "I know," she replied. "That is precisely why the galaxy will hear about it. The capital of the House of Ailen did not rise from the ground the way human cities did, it seemed to unfold from it, terraces of pale stone and living crystal cascading along the curve of a vast inland sea that reflected the twin suns in liquid bands of gold and blue." When the vessel descended through the upper atmosphere, Ethan stood near the viewport with Liara. Beside him, watching structures shaped like spirals and open petals catch the light, nothing looked forced or rigid, every tower bending slightly as if listening to the wind rather than resisting it. The craft settled onto a landing platform that extended from the palace complex, and a quiet procession awaited them, figures arranged in deliberate symmetry, silver patterns across their garments marking rank and responsibility. Ethan became acutely aware of his survey suit, recently cleaned but unmistakably human, the fabric still bearing faint discoloration from sand and heat. The hatch opened with a soft release of pressure and a gentle ramp extended, cool air brushing his face as he stepped forward at Liara's side. No one spoke at first. The silence carried expectation rather than hostility, and yet he felt the weight of countless eyes assessing him, measuring not his strength but his place. Liara moved with composed assurance, her posture neither elevated nor diminished, and when they reached the center of the platform she stopped and turned to face the assembly. This human stands here by my command, she said clearly, her voice amplified without distortion across the open space. He is not a detainee nor a supplicant. He is the reason I stand here at all. A subtle ripple moved through the gathered officials, not shock but recalibration. One elder stepped forward, silver lines tracing intricate paths across his blue skin, and regarded Ethan with careful curiosity. You intervened without treaty, the elder observed, translator rendering the cadence precise. Without promise of compensation. Ethan met his gaze steadily. I saw someone in trouble, he replied. That was enough. The answer seemed to travel farther than the words themselves. Liara lifted her hand slightly and a projection activated above the platform, displaying a soft blue recording of biometric data interwoven with a timestamp from the desert. The crystalline device she had shown him now glowed within the projection, its readings unmistakable. Intent verified, the elder murmured. Selfless allocation confirmed. The phrase sounded clinical, but the expression on his face shifted to something warmer. Among our people, resources are never given without expectation of return, he said. Yet you altered that equation. Ethan felt the attention settle on him more fully, and for a brief second he considered how easily he could have walked away on the dunes, how invisible that choice would have been to anyone but himself. I did not alter anything, he said quietly. I just made a choice. Liara looked at him then, not as a ruler to a subject but as one witness to another. And because you chose, she said, the house of Ailen will choose in return. She faced the assembly once more. From this day forward, Ethan Cole of Earth is recognized as protected ally of our house. His people will receive safe passage across our territories, and any who encounter him will extend the same preservation he offered me. The declaration did not echo with dramatic flourish, it settled over the platform like shade after heat, steady and undeniable. Ethan stood in the center of it, not feeling larger than he had in the desert, only aware that a simple act beneath two unforgiving suns had traveled farther than he ever intended. Recognition did not feel like triumph to Ethan, it felt like standing in a current stronger than himself, carried forward by words he had never asked for, and in the days that followed the palace became both refuge and mirror. He was given quarters overlooking the inland sea, a room shaped in smooth arcs of pale stone and glass that filtered sunlight into soft bands across the floor, and though the temperature remained a comfortable 72 degrees Fahrenheit, he often found himself stepping onto the balcony just to feel real wind against his skin again. Messages began arriving from Earth within hours of the public declaration, official channels lighting up with cautious inquiries and then open astonishment as confirmation followed confirmation. The House of Ailen had not only granted him protection but extended formal corridor access to human vessels across several trade routes previously restricted by complex treaties. Ethan sat at a curved desk one evening, reading a transmission from his former supervisor at the Survey Consortium, who had assumed him lost after the plasma storm, and he let out a slow breath at the realization that his quiet decision in the desert had altered maps far beyond his own survival. A gentle chime announced a visitor and Liara entered without escort, the circlet on her brow reflecting the dim interior light. You are restless, she observed, stepping to the balcony beside him as the twin suns lowered toward the horizon, casting long ribbons of gold across the sea. I am not used to being discussed in council. Chambers, he replied, watching the water catch fire with reflected light. I fix equipment. I log mineral density. I do not usually influence interstellar policy. A faint smile touched her lips. Yet you have. The galaxy values spectacle, she continued, but it is shaped by quieter choices. He studied her profile against the fading light. Does your council agree with what you declared? He asked. She did not hesitate. Some question the precedent. Resources offered without negotiation unsettle established doctrine. Her gaze shifted toward him. But none dispute the data. Your act is recorded in full transparency. Ethan folded his arms along the balcony rail, cool beneath his palms. I did not intend to unsettle doctrine, he said. You intended to help, she corrected softly. That is precisely why it carries weight. A brief silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Far below, small vessels traced gentle paths across the sea, their wakes leaving temporary signatures that dissolved within minutes. Liara turned toward him more fully. "There is one more matter," she said. "The House wishes to establish a joint research outpost on the desert world where we met. Human and Ailen teams working side by side. A symbol of shared trust." Ethan blinked, surprised by the simplicity of the proposal. "You want to build something there," he said. "In that heat?" She inclined her head slightly. "In that heat," she confirmed. "Where survival is not assumed. Where choice is visible." He considered the image of the dunes beneath two suns, the way the wind had erased his footprints within seconds, and then imagined a structure rising not in defiance of the desert but in respect for it. "I would volunteer," he said after a moment. "Not because of protection status. Because it feels right." Liara's eyes held his, steady and luminous. "Then it will be so," she replied. The suns dipped lower, and as the last light traced along the horizon Ethan understood that the desert had taken almost everything from him that day, but in return it had revealed something neither council nor treaty could manufacture, that a single unmeasured choice could redraw the lines of an entire map. The desert looked smaller from orbit, reduced to pale swirls of tan and gold beneath the curvature of the planet, but as the joint expedition vessel descended through the upper atmosphere, Ethan felt the old memory rise in his chest, the taste of heat and sand carried back by instinct rather than wind. Beside him in the forward observation deck stood Liara, no longer in ceremonial attire but in a streamlined field uniform marked with both the sigil of the House of Ailen and a newly added emblem representing Earth's exploratory corps. The outpost site came into view as a geometric outline against the dunes, modular structures arranged in a crescent along the edge of a rocky ridge, their surfaces treated with reflective alloys designed to withstand 120 Fahrenheit peaks without warping. Human engineers had contributed adaptive cooling systems while Ailen architects shaped the layout to channel wind rather than fight it. The vessel touched down with a controlled hum and the hatch opened to a gust of dry air that felt familiar, though less punishing now within the protective field generators surrounding the base. Ethan stepped onto the sand again, boots sinking half an inch before stabilizers engaged, and for a brief moment he saw not the structures or the gathered personnel but the exact patch of ground where he had first seen a figure lying in the glare. A small marker of crystal and steel now stood there, not grand or towering, simply inscribed with coordinates and a single phrase in both languages: "Choice matters." Human technicians adjusted solar arrays along one side of the compound while Ailen scientists calibrated atmospheric sensors on the other, their movements coordinated without tension, conversation flowing through translators that had already begun to blend terminology into shared shorthand. Liara walked with Ethan toward the central dome, the circlet on her brow reflecting sunlight in quiet arcs. "This world will test cooperation," she said, scanning the horizon where dunes shifted in slow motion under the steady wind. "It tested us once already," he replied. She glanced at him, a faint warmth in her expression. "It revealed us," she corrected. Inside the dome the temperature stabilized at 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and a holographic map hovered above a central table displaying mineral deposits, wind patterns, and proposed research corridors. Representatives from both civilizations reviewed plans, adjusting routes to minimize ecological impact while maximizing shared benefit. Ethan found himself explaining soil composition to an Ailen geomancer whose analytical approach differed from his own but complemented it in unexpected ways, and he felt the subtle shift from guest to participant, from protected ally to collaborator. Later, as the twin suns began their descent and the desert glowed in layered amber, Liara joined him outside the dome near the small marker that marked their first meeting. The wind lifted strands of her pale hair and brushed fine grains across his boots, and for a moment the base behind them fell quiet, as if listening. "You altered more than trade routes," she said softly. "You altered expectation." Ethan studied the horizon where heat shimmered above the sand. "I only gave water," he replied. She looked at him steadily. "And in doing so, you gave a different future." The lights of the outpost flickered on one by one as dusk approached, not in defiance of the desert but in harmony with it, and as Ethan watched human and Aaron silhouettes move side by side beneath the fading suns, he understood that the smallest gesture, offered without calculation, had become a foundation no storm could erase. The desert cooled quickly after sunset, the temperature dropping from 110 degrees Fahrenheit to the low 70s within an hour, and the joint outpost shifted into its quieter rhythm as exterior panels dimmed and interior systems hummed at a steady, controlled frequency. Ethan stood alone at the edge of the ridge where the first marker had been placed, the small inscription catching the last silver wash of twilight while wind traced faint lines across the sand. Months had passed since the base became operational, and what had begun as cautious collaboration had matured into routine partnership, shared data flowing between human servers and Aaron archives without hesitation, trade vessels crossing once restricted corridors under newly ratified agreements that cited a single documented event as catalyst. He remembered the exact weight of the canteen in his hand that day, the hesitation, the dryness in his throat, and he found it almost surreal that entire diplomatic frameworks now referenced that moment in formal language. Behind him, the outpost lights formed a crescent of soft illumination against the dunes, and silhouettes moved within the dome as technicians completed late calibrations. Laughter drifted faintly through an open channel, human and Aaron voices blending in easy familiarity. Footsteps approached without urgency, and Liara joined him at the ridge, her field uniform reflecting starlight in subdued lines. Above them, the sky had deepened to a clear indigo scattered with constellations unfamiliar to Earth, yet steadily becoming mapped and named by joint teams. "You still return here at the end of each cycle," she observed quietly. "It is where the equation changed," he replied, watching a small survey drone arc across the horizon before settling near the perimeter grid. She folded her hands loosely in front of her, gaze following the same line of dunes that once threatened to erase them both. "The Council has adopted a new principle," she said after a moment. "It states that survival alone is insufficient as the measure of a civilization." Ethan glanced at her, surprised by the phrasing. "And what is the new measure?" he asked. She turned slightly, the circlet on her brow catching a faint star. "The willingness to give without assurance of return," she answered. He exhaled softly, not in disbelief but in quiet recognition. "That is a risky doctrine," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "But it is one we now understand." A light breeze carried cooler air up from the sea beyond the dunes, brushing against his face and lifting a trace of sand that shimmered briefly in the starlight before settling again. In the distance, a human transport descended toward the landing pad, its navigation lights blinking steadily, granted safe passage through corridors once closed by suspicion. Ethan looked back at the marker at their feet and then at the illuminated base, the collaboration alive in every movement within its walls. "I did not intend to change anything," he said. "You intended to act according to your nature," Liara replied. "That is what changed everything." The wind continued its patient sweep across the desert, reshaping the surface grain by grain, but the foundation beneath the outpost held firm, anchored not only by engineering but by memory. Ethan watched the stars reflect faintly in Liara's golden eyes and realized that in a galaxy defined by power and calculation, the smallest unmeasured choice had become the quietest form of strength.